Hello, today we're going to look at the mistakes that are commonly made in the National 5 history exam. We're going to think about different question types, the mistakes that are made, and by doing that we will hopefully avoid making those mistakes ourselves when we come to sit the exam. So straight into it, first question we're going to talk about is the how fully question. Now the common mistakes in the how fully question are, first of all, not making a judgment. If you don't start off by saying source A quite fully explains the reasons why the slave trade benefited Britain, or source A quite fully describes the actions of the Ku Klux Klan, your maximum mark that you can get is 2. So you must make sure that you always start off with a judgment. Another big problem is that pupils often miss out key parts of the quote, so they don't quote fully. So they'll quote a little bit of a sentence, or they'll miss out the start, miss out the end. Make sure you're quoting the full sentence. If you quote the full sentence, then you're absolutely, definitely guaranteed to get the mark. And then the third thing that is you often see in answers is that pupils will write a recall point and say, oh, the source doesn't mention, but then say something that's actually in the source. So make sure you've carefully read the source. Just because it's not one of the points that you've quoted, it might still be in the source. There are usually 4 points in the source that answer the question. So if you've written 3, there might be one other one that's about the thing that you're going to talk about. So make sure that whatever you're saying the source does not mention, that is not actually mentioned. Then to the evaluate question. So the common mistakes in the evaluate question. Most common mistake made in the evaluate question is not using the word useful. Because you're evaluating the usefulness, you have to say whether it makes the source more useful, or makes the source useful, or makes the source less useful. If you don't use that key word, then you're not going to get a mark. So if you've not said useful 5 times, you're not going to get full marks. Make sure you say useful. Source A is useful because it's written by a historian. This means that they will have researched and used sources to inform themselves. Source A is useful because it was written in 2014. This means it was written with the benefit of hindsight. That's all fine. You've got to make sure you're using the word useful. Another big problem is people often miss out the date when writing the time mark. So source A was written in 1905, 2015, 1826. You've got to include that, otherwise you don't get the time mark. And then when putting in source content points, failing to say this makes the source useful as I know it's true from my own knowledge. So adding that bit. It is not the same as the how fully question where you can just write the source point and then leave it. You've got to write the source point and then give a reason why it's useful. And the reason why it's useful is because you know it's true from your own knowledge, or you know it's accurate. On to comparison questions. Quite a few common mistakes in comparison questions. The main one being not using key words such as agree or disagree. If you don't have the word agree or disagree at least 4 times, then you're not going to get full marks. So you've got to use the word agree or disagree. Sources A and B agree, or sources A and B disagree, or source A states, source B agrees, or source A states, source B disagrees. You've got to use those words. Another big problem is that you've got to read the sources carefully. So you've got to read the sources and then make sure the points that you're highlighting actually are comparisons. There are often key words in each sentence, so you get something like left wing, or petitions, or Catholicism, or something like that, and these kind of sources. So you're just looking for keywords that overlap between the 2 sources, and then that is usually indicative of a comparison. And the other big problem is people quite often tend to make overall comparisons. The overall comparison is perhaps the easiest mark in the whole exam, because all you have to do is just parrot back the question and then use the word agree or disagree. So sources A and B agree about the attitudes towards immigrants in early 20th century America. Sources A and B disagree about the effects of the French Revolution on the abolishing of the slave trade. It's very straightforward. It's basically just the question plus 1 extra word that you've added yourself. So make sure you do it. Okay, on to explain question. Now, the common mistake in the explain question is probably the most common mistake in the whole paper, which is that when answering this, people don't actually explain. In order to explain, you must make sure that you're providing a reason why something happened. So it might be, explain the reason why the abolitionist campaign was successful. Now, you might say petitions are a reason why the abolitionist campaign was successful. That's a fact, but it's not an explanation because you've not explained what petitions did to make the abolitionist campaign successful. So you'd have to say, one of the reasons why the abolitionist campaign was successful were petitions. This meant that the abolitionists were able to demonstrate to MPs how popular the campaign was. So you're using the fact and then making sure you're explaining how this had an effect, it caused something to happen. The other issue here is not using process language, and what that means is that there is nothing to demonstrate that the fact that you're discussing has had an effect. So for the structure that we use, if you say this meant that, then you are doing some processing, then you're explaining that the fact that you've brought up had an effect. So every time if you use the this meant that structure, then you are very likely to be able to demonstrate that you are actually explaining a reason why something had an effect. So that is very important. When you're doing the explain questions, you've got to make sure you're actually explaining, and by using the structure that we give you, you will do that. On to the 9-mark essay. Common mistakes are, first, when you're in introduction, not listing 3 different factors. So explain to what extent was can't think of one. To what extent was William Wilberforce the main reason why slave trade was abolished? So you might say there were many reasons why the slave trade was abolished, such as William Wilberforce, petitions, and the sugar boycott. That's a mark because it's mentioned 3 different factors. If you only mention 2, there were many reasons why the slave trade was abolished, including William Wilberforce and the sugar boycott. You won't get a mark because you need to have at least 3 different factors, one of which should be the isolated factor, and 2 that you've thought of yourself. The next thing that is a mistake is when people don't discuss the isolated factor. So the question might be about William Wilberforce, or the isolated factor might be William Wilberforce, and you go on and start talking about sugar boycott, and then petitions, and then Olodai Equiano. That's not going to get you the marks because you've struggled a little bit to answer the question there, and it can be quite tough to get the conclusion marks and things like imbalance marks and stuff if you're not doing that. The other side of this is that quite often people will only discuss the isolated factor. And if you only discuss the isolated factor, so you just give lots of facts about William Wilberforce, you might have given 5 different facts about William Wilberforce that led him to help abolish the slave trade, you're going to miss out on the balance mark because you've not brought in an extra factor, and you will also miss out on 2 knowledge marks because you can only get 3 knowledge marks per factor. So make sure you're talking about at least 2 and preferably 3 different factors. So the isolated factor and at least 2 others. The other thing that I find very frustrating is when people write a fantastic essay that's all correct, but each knowledge point they've given doesn't actually answer the question. So William Wilberforce gave speeches in Parliament. William Wilberforce was a very good organiser. Now, they're all true, they're both true, but they're not linked to the question. So William Wilberforce gave speeches in Parliament which convinced many MPs to back abolition. That is a fact that is linked to the question, so you've got to make sure your facts link to the question in order to answer the question, because if you don't do that, you won't get any knowledge marks. Finally, the conclusion, as I've said many times, should just be the question backwards. So, to what extent was William Wilberforce the main reason for the abolition of slavery? William Wilberforce was the main reason for the abolition of slavery. And then the supporting reason should just be something you've mentioned. This was because William Wilberforce gave many speeches in Parliament which convinced MPs. Job done. People not adding the supporting reason always frustrates me because it's an easy mark. It's just something you've already mentioned. Use a factor that you've talked about in the essay. And finally, on to describe questions. Now, describe questions are very straightforward, so they're not actually all that many common mistakes, but there are a couple. The first one is not reading the question properly. Now, this is obviously a mistake for every question, but does tend to pop up in the describe question in particular. People think, oh, that's dead easy, it just needs 4 facts, just bish bash bosh, right? 4 facts down. However, The 4 facts must be relevant to the question. If the question is asking you about working conditions for immigrants, you can't talk about living conditions. If the question is asking you about the events of the bus boycott, you can't talk about the Little Orc 9 protest. So you've got to make sure you're being relevant. And another thing that I see not hugely often, but every now and again you see someone that's written pages for the described question. It's 4 marks, 4 points. You do not have to go into a huge amount of detail. It is enough to say if the question was about, say, trench conditions. Soldiers often experienced muddy trenches which made their feet wet. That is fine. You don't have to go into a huge amount of detail. You don't have to write a novel. So don't write too much. Right, hopefully that has given you some idea about some of the common problems when completing the exam questions, and if you know what the problems are, then hopefully you'll be able to avoid them and thus do very well.